The conference room was filled with the hum of whispered conversations, punctuated by the occasional stifled laugh. The board members sat at the long, polished table, their smug expressions barely concealed as they exchanged knowing glances. At the head of the table, Bradley Foster leaned back in my mother's chair, the chair she had occupied for over 2 decades before her passing. He had wasted no time in claiming it as his own, his hands folded behind his head in an almost theatrical display of confidence. I stood at the other end of the table, my back straight, my face impassive. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing any flicker of emotion. My mother had always taught me to control my reactions, to never let an enemy see my fear. And right now, these people were my enemies. Bradley tapped his fingers against the table, feigning boredom before finally addressing me. "You're fired," he announced, his smirk widening. "Mommy's not here to protect you anymore." Laughter erupted around the table. A chorus of scoffs, chuckles, and murmured insults. The CEO's spoiled daughter. She really thought she had a future here? Guess she'll finally have to work for a living. The weight of their mockery pressed against me, but I didn't flinch. I let them enjoy their moment of victory, their illusion of power. They thought this was the end of me. They thought they had won. Bradley slid a sleek black folder across the table toward me. "I'd suggest you don't make this messy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We wouldn't want a scandal, would we?" I flipped open the folder without hesitation. Inside, neatly stacked papers accused me of misusing company funds, fabricated numbers, twisted truths, and exaggerated claims, all designed to discredit me. My fingers traced the edge of the paper as I processed their strategy. They wanted me out. They wanted me disgraced. And more than anything, they wanted me to fight back in a way that would justify their claims. I exhaled softly, lifted my eyes, and smiled. A small, calculated smile that made Bradley's smirk falter for the briefest second. "I see," I said smoothly, closing the folder and sliding it back toward him. "Thank you for the clarification." The laughter around the table faded slightly, replaced with confused glances. This wasn't the reaction they had anticipated. They had expected rage, indignation, maybe even begging. But I gave them nothing. Bradley tilted his head. "So that's it? You're just going to walk away?" I turned on my heel without another word and strode out of the conference room. The sound of my heels against the marble floor echoed through the hallway, steady and unshaken. By the time I reached my office, the rumors had already begun to spread. Assistants, executives, and interns whispered in hushed voices, some casting sympathetic glances, others barely concealing their amusement. Inside my office, the walls were lined with framed achievements. Awards, successful acquisitions, projects I had spearheaded. They had never seen me as anything more than my mother's daughter, but these walls told a different story. I walked to my desk, where a single framed photo rested beside my computer. My mother and I stood side by side in the image, her hand resting on my shoulder, her eyes filled with the quiet determination that had built this empire. I picked up the photo, running my thumb over the glass before tucking it under my arm. That was all I needed. Security arrived within minutes, their presence rehearsed and efficient. They had been waiting for this moment, eager to escort me out like a criminal. One of them cleared his throat awkwardly. "Miss Lancaster, we're going to have to." I held up a hand, silencing him. "I know the way out." I didn't rush. I took my time walking down the hall, past the open doors where my former colleagues pretended to be hard at work, their gazes flickering toward me the moment they thought I wasn't looking. As I stepped into the elevator, Bradley appeared at the end of the hall, arms crossed over his chest, reveling in his triumph. "Don't take it personally," he called out, his voice dripping with insincerity. "It's just business." I met his gaze just as the elevator doors began to close. And then, just before they shut completely, I let my smile return. They thought they had won. They had no idea. They had no idea who really owned 73% of the company. For years, I had played the role they expected of me, the privileged daughter of a brilliant CEO, someone they dismissed as an accessory to my mother's legacy rather than a force in my own right. They saw my title as a mere courtesy, an inheritance rather than an earned position. And I let them believe it. That belief was their greatest weakness. From the moment I received my first company shares, I had been building my position in silence. Every bonus, commission, and stock option I earned wasn't spent on luxury or indulgence. It was funneled into carefully constructed shell companies, each designed to acquire a fraction of the company's stock under different names. My mother had taught me this strategy early on. Power wasn't in what people could see, it was in what they didn't know existed. Now, with 73% under my control, I was no longer just a stakeholder. I was the company. And they were about to learn exactly what that meant. That night, I sat in my penthouse apartment, the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The lights of the buildings flickered like a constellation of opportunity, each one a reminder that power belonged to those who knew how to wield it. My phone rested beside me on the glass table, and I reached for it, dialing the first number on my list. The call barely rang before a familiar voice answered. "Miss Lancaster," came the crisp tone of Alan Weiss, my lead attorney. "I assume you're ready to proceed?" "Yes." I leaned back, my fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of my chair. "It's time to trigger the audit." Alan hesitated, only briefly. "You're certain? This will cause a disruption." I smiled. "Good. The board needs to be disrupted." He exhaled sharply, the sound laced with a mixture of anticipation and admiration. "Understood. I'll have the paperwork filed by morning." I ended the call and immediately dialed the next number. This time, the voice that answered belonged to Richard Sterling, one of the company's most influential clients. He had been an ally of my mother's, a man whose loyalty was built on trust and results. Bradley and the board had no idea how vital he was to the company's success, nor did they realize the extent of my relationship with him. "Richard," I said smoothly. If it isn't the real force behind Lancaster Industries," he said, a chuckle in his voice. "I heard about the little circus act they pulled today." I allowed myself a small laugh. "I assume you also heard about their plans to restructure?" "Let me guess," he mused. "They're planning to slash budgets and cut talent in the name of efficiency, all while selling off your mother's Lexington Street project?" "Exactly." I traced the rim of my wine glass with my fingertip. "And I assume you also know how catastrophic the decision would be?" "I do," he said. "And more importantly, so do my partners. We're not interested in working with a company that sabotages its own long-term value for short-term gains. If they follow through with this, we'll be withdrawing our contracts." I smiled. That's what I needed to hear. Richard sighed. "You know, your mother would be proud of you, Evelyn. She always said you were smarter than they realized." I let those words settle for a moment before replying. "Then it's time to prove her right." When the call ended, I sat in silence for a few moments, staring out at the city. The board thought they had exiled me. They thought they had stripped me of my power. They were about to learn otherwise. The following morning, Bradley sat in his new office, his feet propped up on the desk. The leather chair, the polished mahogany desk, the framed photos of past CEOs, he had already made himself at home in a position he had no right to claim. The knock on his door was impatient, and before he could respond, the company's chief financial officer, Diane Miller, stormed inside. Bradley barely lifted an eyebrow. "Diane," he drawled. "Didn't anyone teach you to knock?" She dropped a thick stack of papers onto his desk, her expression tight with barely concealed panic. "We have a problem." Bradley sighed, rubbing his temples. "What now?" Diane inhaled sharply. "A shareholder audit has been triggered." His feet dropped from the desk immediately. "What?" "The auditors are already going through the records. The company's entire ownership structure is being analyzed." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "And that's not the worst part." Bradley's jaw tightened. "Then what is?" Diane hesitated, as if saying the words aloud would make them more real. "The audit revealed that someone has been acquiring the majority of the company's shares. Quietly. Systematically. And they now hold 73% of Lancaster Industries." Silence. Then, slowly, Bradley's expression twisted from confusion into something darker. "Who?" Diane swallowed. "Evelyn Lancaster." The color drained from his face. He lurched forward, flipping through the papers, searching for some loophole, some mistake, some explanation that would make this go away. But there was none. For years, they had dismissed me, mocked me, believed I was nothing more than a spoiled heiress playing at business. Now, they were realizing the truth. I wasn't just my mother's daughter. I was the one they should have feared all along. They had no idea who really owned 73% of the company. For years, I had played the role they expected of me, the privileged daughter of a brilliant CEO, someone they dismissed as an accessory to my mother's legacy rather than a force in my own right. They saw my title as a mere courtesy, an inheritance rather than an earned position. And I let them believe it. That belief was their greatest weakness. From the moment I received my first company shares, I had been building my position in silence. Every bonus, commission, and stock option I earned wasn't spent on luxury or indulgence. It was funneled into carefully constructed shell companies, each designed to acquire a fraction of the company's stock under different names. My mother had taught me this strategy early on. Power wasn't in what people could see, it was in what they didn't know existed. Now, with 73% under my control, I was no longer just a stakeholder. I was the company. And they were about to learn exactly what that meant. That night, I sat in my penthouse apartment, the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The lights of the buildings flickered like a constellation of opportunity, each one a reminder that power belonged to those who knew how to wield it. My phone rested beside me on the glass table, and I reached for it, dialing the first number on my list. The call barely rang before a familiar voice answered. "Miss Lancaster," came the crisp tone of Alan Weiss, my lead attorney. "I assume you're ready to proceed?" "Yes." I leaned back, my fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of my chair. "It's time to trigger the audit." Alan hesitated, only briefly. "You're certain? This will cause a disruption." I smiled. "Good. The board needs to be disrupted." He exhaled sharply, the sound laced with a mixture of anticipation and admiration. "Understood. I'll have the paperwork filed by morning." I ended the call and immediately dialed the next number. This time, the voice that answered belonged to Richard Sterling, one of the company's most influential clients. He had been an ally of my mother's, a man whose loyalty was built on trust and results. Bradley and the board had no idea how vital he was to the company's success, nor did they realize the extent of my relationship with him. "Richard," I said smoothly. If it isn't the real force behind Lancaster Industries," he said, a chuckle in his voice. "I heard about the little circus act they pulled today." I allowed myself a small laugh. "I assume you also heard about their plans to restructure?" "Let me guess," he mused. "They're planning to slash budgets and cut talent in the name of efficiency, all while selling off your mother's Lexington Street project?" "Exactly." I traced the rim of my wine glass with my fingertip. "And I assume you also know how catastrophic the decision would be?" "I do," he said. "And more importantly, so do my partners. We're not interested in working with a company that sabotages its own long-term value for short-term gains. If they follow through with this, we'll be withdrawing our contracts." I smiled. That's what I needed to hear. Richard sighed. "You know, your mother would be proud of you, Evelyn. She always said you were smarter than they realized." I let those words settle for a moment before replying. "Then it's time to prove her right." When the call ended, I sat in silence for a few moments, staring out at the city. The board thought they had exiled me. They thought they had stripped me of my power. They were about to learn otherwise. The following morning, Bradley sat in his new office, his feet propped up on the desk. The leather chair, the polished mahogany desk, the framed photos of past CEOs, he had already made himself at home in a position he had no right to claim. The knock on his door was impatient, and before he could respond, the company's chief financial officer, Diane Miller, stormed inside. Bradley barely lifted an eyebrow. "Diane," he drawled. "Didn't anyone teach you to knock?" She dropped a thick stack of papers onto his desk, her expression tight with barely concealed panic. "We have a problem." Bradley sighed, rubbing his temples. "What now?" Diane inhaled sharply. "A shareholder audit has been triggered." His feet dropped from the desk immediately. "What?" "The auditors are already going through the records. The company's entire ownership structure is being analyzed." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. And that's not the worst part. Bradley's jaw tightened. Then what is? Diane hesitated, as if saying the words aloud would make them more real. The audit revealed that someone has been acquiring the majority of the company's shares. Quietly. Systematically. And they now hold 73% of Lancaster Industries. Silence. Then, slowly, Bradley's expression twisted from confusion into something darker. Who? Diane swallowed. Evelyn Lancaster. The color drained from his face. He lurched forward, flipping through the papers, searching for some loophole, some mistake, some explanation that would make this go away. But there was none. For years, they had dismissed me, mocked me, believed I was nothing more than a spoiled heiress playing at business. Now, they were realizing the truth. I wasn't just my mother's daughter. I was the one they should have feared all along. The downfall of Lancaster Industries had begun the moment they removed me from my position. Bradley and his allies, drunk on their own self-importance, were too arrogant to realize the damage they were doing. They thought they had won. But in their rush to claim victory, they had exposed every one of their weaknesses. I had spent years preparing for this moment, and now I watched as they eagerly dug their own graves. Bradley sat at the head of the boardroom table, a place he had no right to occupy. His usual smirk was in place as he addressed the board, radiating false confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, leaning back in his chair as though the empire he had stolen wasn't crumbling beneath him, "we are about to enter a new era for Lancaster Industries." Several board members exchanged uncertain glances. The audit had shaken them, though few were willing to admit it. They had always trusted Bradley's ability to maneuver through corporate politics. Now, they weren't so sure. "As you know," Bradley continued, "our first order of business is to streamline operations. The company has been weighed down by inefficient projects and unnecessary expenditures. We need to be leaner, more aggressive. That means cutting costs where necessary." Cutting costs. A polite way of saying that he was gutting the company from the inside out. The first wave of layoffs hit within the week. Bradley targeted the most experienced employees, the ones my mother had trusted, the architects of Lancaster's success. He saw them as remnants of an old-era deadweight. But I saw something else. These were the people who understood the industry better than anyone else. And now, thanks to Bradley's reckless ambition, they were mine to reclaim. I made a series of quiet calls, ensuring that those who had been discarded found new positions in my network. Some I placed in partner firms, others I held in reserve, knowing they would be essential when the time came. Meanwhile, Bradley continued his rampage. Next, he targeted the Lexington Street development, my mother's most ambitious project. It was meant to be her legacy, a state-of-the-art urban development designed to revolutionize the city. Sustainable, profitable, and decades ahead of its time. But to Bradley, it was just another asset to sell. "The Lexington project is draining company resources," he declared at the next board meeting, waving a dismissive hand. "It's a vanity project, and quite frankly, we don't need it." Diane Miller, the CFO, frowned. "Bradley, that project is projected to bring in long-term revenue that..." Bradley cut her off. "Long-term revenue? We don't have time for that. Investors want immediate returns." Several board members nodded reluctantly. They had never been visionaries. They followed the scent of short-term profit like vultures circling a carcass. I watched from the outside, documenting every decision they made. Every reckless budget cut. Every terminated contract. Every internal email that exposed their lack of foresight. They were building their own destruction. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to let it collapse. Bradley's overconfidence only grew. At one point, he had the audacity to go on record in a media interview, boasting about how Lancaster Industries had become more efficient under his leadership. The previous administration, he said, the corners of his mouth curling in satisfaction, was sentimental. Business isn't about sentiment. It's about results. I watched the interview, shaking my head. Bradley had no idea how business actually worked. He assumed that results could be measured only in quarterly earnings, that success was about cutting costs rather than creating sustainable value. He didn't understand the delicate balance of maintaining investor confidence, client relationships, and public reputation. And his ignorance was already costing him. Clients began pulling their contracts, concerned about instability within the company. Employees, those who remained, grew uneasy, whispering about the sudden shifts in leadership. The company's culture, once built on trust and innovation, was unraveling into fear and uncertainty. And then there was the Lexington deal. Bradley had been so eager to offload the project that he ignored the fine print in the contracts. He didn't realize that several of the key investors had clauses allowing them to withdraw their funding if the project was abandoned. One by one, those investors began backing out. Without that funding, the company's financials took another hit. Bradley tried to cover it up, but I had already secured access to internal reports through trusted sources. Each financial misstep, each desperate attempt to maintain control, each mistake. I recorded it all. The media had started asking questions. Investors were growing uneasy, and the board, once so confident in their choice, began to whisper among themselves. I knew what was coming next. They would look for a scapegoat. And when the time came, they would turn on Bradley just as quickly as they had turned on me. I sat in my penthouse, sipping a glass of wine as I flipped through the latest reports. Everything was going exactly as planned. I had let them believe they had won, let them make their mistakes in plain sight. But soon, the reckoning would begin. And when it did, I would be the one standing at the top. 1 month later, Lancaster Industries was in chaos. It started with whispers in the halls, cautious glances exchanged between executives who had once laughed at me. The confidence that had once filled the boardroom had eroded into something closer to fear. The audit had rattled them. The sudden client withdrawals had shaken their faith in Bradley's leadership. The Lexington Street project, once a shining beacon of Lancaster Industries' future, was now a symbol of their incompetence. And then, the bombshell dropped. A formal shareholder report was released, revealing the truth. The majority stake in the company had been quietly acquired by an unknown entity over the past 5 years. 73%. The news spread like wildfire through financial circles, corporate offices, and media outlets. Investors were scrambling, the stock market reacted violently, and Bradley Foster, he finally understood the extent of his mistake. The emergency board meeting was called within hours. Bradley sat at the head of the table, his usual smirk absent. The boardroom, once filled with smug confidence, was now an arena of barely controlled panic. Diane Miller, the CFO, was the first to speak. "We need answers," she said, her voice tight. "Who the hell owns this company?" Her question hung in the air, the weight of it suffocating. Bradley's grip tightened around the edge of the table. "We're looking into it," he said, though it was clear he was barely keeping it together. "It could be an outside takeover attempt." Diane scoffed. "We would have seen an outside takeover coming. This was done from the inside." Bradley didn't respond. He was too busy staring at the report in front of him, the same one they had all received that morning. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. These were powerful people, men and women who had controlled industries, influenced policies, dictated the fates of corporations. And yet, in this moment, they were powerless. They had spent the past month reveling in their victory, believing they had rid themselves of the CEO's spoiled daughter. Now, they were realizing the truth. They hadn't won. They had walked straight into a trap. I arrived at the meeting 10 minutes late. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted them to sit in their panic a little longer. When I walked through the boardroom doors, the room fell silent. Every gaze snapped toward me, expressions shifting from confusion to horror to reluctant understanding. Bradley, who had been leaning forward with his elbows on the table, sat back slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Evelyn." He said my name like a curse, like he had just now pieced everything together. I took my time walking around the table, my heels clicking against the floor, the only sound in the room. "Apologies for my tardiness," I said smoothly. "I had some urgent business to attend to." No one spoke. They were too busy realizing the reality of the situation. I didn't take one of the open chairs. Instead, I moved to the head of the table, the seat my mother had once occupied, the seat that rightfully belonged to me. I placed both hands on the polished wood and leaned forward slightly. I assume you've all read the report? Silence. Then, finally, Diane cleared her throat. Evelyn, she started carefully, are you telling us that I own the majority of Lancaster Industries? I finished for her. I let the moment stretch, watching their reactions. Yes, I confirmed. I do. A ripple of tension moved through the room. The reality of my words settled in, sinking into every board member, every executive who had signed off on my termination, believing they had removed me from power. Bradley's jaw tightened. That's not possible, he said, though his voice lacked the usual arrogance. We would have known if you were buying shares. I let out a soft laugh. Would you? You never even noticed what was happening to your own company while you were too busy sitting in my mother's chair. His hands curled into fists. This is a joke. It's not, I replied, tilting my head. You just never paid enough attention to see it coming. Bradley shot a look at the board members, as if hoping for some kind of support. But there was none. They were staring at me now, waiting. So, I continued, straightening. Let's get to the point. I pulled a thick folder from my bag and placed it on the table. This, I said, tapping the cover, is a formal motion for the removal of Bradley Foster as CEO, effective immediately. The air in the room shifted. Bradley let out a sharp laugh, though it was more forced than anything else. You think you can just walk in here and... I don't think, Bradley, I cut in. I know. I turned my attention to the board. Let me make this simple. The majority stakeholder has the power to appoint and remove executives at will. I own 73% of this company. I glanced at Diane, who had spent the past month growing increasingly disillusioned with Bradley's leadership. Diane, could you remind the board what percentage is needed to override any previous decisions? Diane hesitated. Then, with the faintest trace of a smile, she said, 51%. I spread my hands. So, you see, this isn't a debate. This isn't a vote. This is reality. I turned my gaze back to Bradley. You're done. For the first time since this all began, Bradley looked genuinely afraid. He was smart enough to know there was no way out of this. He opened his mouth to argue, to fight, but before he could get the words out, 2 security guards stepped into the room. Mr. Foster, one of them said, we need you to come with us. Bradley turned to the board, searching for an ally, but he found none. The people who had once backed him were now silent, unwilling to go down with him. His face turned red, his jaw clenched, but he knew there was nothing he could do. Slowly, he pushed back his chair and stood. His hands curled into fists at his sides. You're making a mistake, he snarled, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. This company is going to fall apart without me. I smiled. Oh, I think we'll be just fine. And then, with security on either side of him, Bradley Foster was escorted out of Lancaster Industries. The moment the door shut behind him, I let out a breath and turned to the rest of the board. Now, I said, sitting down at the head of the table. Let's get to work. The moment I sat down at the head of the table, the seat my mother had occupied for decades, a wave of silence settled over the boardroom. The same people who had once laughed at me, who had dismissed me as nothing more than the CEO's spoiled daughter, now sat rigid in their chairs, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. They had spent the past month enabling Bradley Foster, believing his short-sighted vision was the future of Lancaster Industries. And now, they realized they had backed the wrong person. I steepled my fingers, allowing the weight of the moment to stretch. Let them squirm. Let them feel the consequences of their misplaced trust. Diane Miller, ever the professional, was the first to speak. Evelyn. I lifted a hand, cutting her off. It's Miss Lancaster. She blinked. Around the table, the board members exchanged wary glances. They were realizing something crucial. The woman they had underestimated no longer existed. I leaned back, my tone cool. Let's address the obvious first. As of today, Bradley Foster is no longer associated with Lancaster Industries. His termination is final, and security will ensure that he does not set foot in this building again. No one argued. Even those who had once championed Bradley sat in silence, unwilling to challenge me. They had seen the writing on the wall. I continued, flipping open the folder in front of me. Effective immediately, the Lexington Street project is reinstated at full capacity. A murmur of surprise rippled through the board. Miss Lancaster, one of the executives, spoke cautiously. The Lexington project is non-negotiable. I cut in, my voice sharp. That project was my mother's vision, and its cancellation was one of the most reckless decisions ever made under Bradley's leadership. I have already spoken with our key investors, and they are willing to re-engage. Diane leaned forward. You spoke to them already? Of course, I replied smoothly. I wasn't going to reclaim this company without a strategy. A few board members shifted in their seats, perhaps realizing that I had outmaneuvered them before they even saw the first move. I let the silence settle before continuing. I want an immediate financial assessment of all contracts and vendor relationships that were altered under Bradley's tenure. I need a full report on losses, client withdrawals, and internal morale. I want a direct line of communication with every major department head by the end of the day. One of the older board members, a man who had been in this company long before I was born, finally spoke. And what's your long-term vision for Lancaster Industries, Miss Lancaster? I smiled slightly. Growth, stability, and most importantly, restoration. This company was built on innovation, on strategic expansion, on smart, long-term investments. That's what made it a powerhouse under my mother's leadership. We're returning to that model, starting today. There were no further objections. One by one, the board members nodded, some out of agreement, others out of resignation. They knew they had no choice. I tapped my fingers against the table. Now, let's talk about the damage Bradley has done and how we're going to fix it. The next few hours were a whirlwind of meetings, negotiations, and crisis control. Bradley had gutted the company, and it showed. Employee morale was at an all-time low. Departments were understaffed, contracts had been severed, and public perception had started to shift against us. I had work to do. The first call I made was to Richard Sterling, one of our most influential clients. He answered immediately. Evelyn, he said smoothly. I assume this is about the company's recent shakeup? Good to hear from you, Richard, I said, keeping my tone professional but warm. I trust you've read the reports? I have. I also saw the footage of Bradley Foster being escorted out of your building. Quite the statement. I smiled faintly. A necessary one. Richard chuckled. I take it this means the Lexington project is back on the table? Not just back on the table, I confirmed. I want it bigger. Better. I know some of your partners pulled out after Bradley's disastrous decisions, but I'd like to extend a personal invitation for them to return. There was a pause. Then Richard said, You're serious about this? Very, I said. My mother's legacy deserves better than to be thrown away by incompetent men who don't understand long-term value. Another pause. Then Richard spoke. You're your mother's daughter, Evelyn. I'll see what I can do. I knew what that meant. He wasn't just saying he'd consider it, he was already making calls. One by one, the pieces were falling into place. The next call I made was to my legal team. Alan, I greeted my attorney, leaning back in my chair. We need to go over the contracts Bradley signed in the past few weeks. Any breaches, any questionable terms, I want to know everything. Alan's voice was sharp. I was already looking into that. And I found something you'll want to see. I sat up straighter. Tell me. Bradley was in talks to sell off part of our infrastructure to one of our competitors, Alan said. It wasn't finalized yet, but the paperwork is here. He was about to give away some of Lancaster's most valuable resources for pennies. My fingers tightened around the armrest of my chair. Send me everything you have. I ended the call, exhaling slowly. Bradley's recklessness ran even deeper than I had anticipated. He hadn't just sabotaged the company, he had tried to dismantle it entirely. I should have expected it. Men like him didn't build things. They only knew how to tear them down. By the end of the day, the first steps of my plan were already in motion. 1. The Lexington project was officially reinstated, with investors beginning to return. 2. Internal morale was addressed, employees were reassured that the company was stabilizing. 3. Client relationships were being rebuilt, ensuring that those who left under Bradley's leadership were welcomed back. 4. A full legal investigation into Bradley's actions was underway. And most importantly, Bradley Foster was gone. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a moment of stillness. I stood by my office window, gazing out at the city. They had thought they could take everything from me. They thought I was just a powerless heiress, someone they could remove without consequence. But they had forgotten who I was. I was my mother's daughter. And this was only the beginning. The press conference was held at noon, and the tension in the air was palpable. The room was packed: journalists, corporate analysts, investors, and even some former employees who had been affected by Bradley's reckless leadership. Every camera was pointed at the stage where I stood, calm and composed, waiting for the moment to strike. Behind me, a massive screen displayed the Lancaster Industries logo, standing as a silent testament to the company my mother had built. A company that I had just reclaimed from the hands of a fool. The reporters murmured among themselves, throwing glances at the official statement they had received just minutes before the event started. Lancaster Industries reinstates the Lexington Street Development Project. Lancaster Industries confirms termination of former CEO Bradley Foster. Lancaster Industries to address recent claims regarding environmental impact. That last point was why I was standing here. Bradley's last, desperate move had been a pathetic attempt to discredit me. He had leaked falsified environmental reports, hoping to spark a scandal that would stall my momentum. The data suggested that the Lexington Street project posed a significant threat to the city's environmental stability, claims that, if believed, could cost us billions and ruin my reputation overnight. Too bad for him, I had been prepared. I let the murmurs settle before stepping forward to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady. "I appreciate you all taking the time to be here today. As many of you know, Lancaster Industries has undergone significant changes over the past month. With those changes come challenges, but also opportunities. Today, I'm here to address both." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the crowd. The Lexington Street development is one of the most ambitious projects in our company's history. It is not only a financial investment, but a promise to the future of the city. However, in the past few days, misleading information has been spread regarding the project's environmental impact. I want to be clear, these claims are entirely false. A few reporters stirred, their pens scratching furiously. One raised his hand. "Miss Lancaster, are you saying that the environmental reports were fabricated?" I turned slightly, nodding toward the screen behind me. At my cue, a new document appeared, a detailed breakdown of the real environmental assessment, one that had been conducted under my mother's original vision. "I'm not just saying it," I replied. "I'm proving it." The room went silent. These are the original environmental assessments conducted over the past 5 years. As you can see, all reports confirmed that the Lexington project was designed with the highest sustainability standards. Our energy solutions, water management, and green infrastructure initiatives have been praised as some of the most advanced in the industry. I let that information sink in before continuing. The false reports were submitted anonymously to the press and certain regulatory agencies. However, my team traced the source, and all evidence points to one individual. The screen shifted again, displaying a set of confidential emails, complete with timestamps and sender information. At the bottom, in glaring clarity, was the name of the sender: Bradley Foster. The gasps in the room were almost satisfying. As you can see, the reports were intentionally falsified in an effort to damage my leadership and the integrity of this project. I continued, my tone even. This was not a mistake. It was a deliberate act of corporate sabotage. The reporters erupted. "Miss Lancaster, does this mean legal action will be taken? Are you saying Bradley Foster attempted to manipulate stock prices with false claims? Will this affect investor confidence in Lancaster Industries?" I raised a hand, silencing the questions. "Lancaster Industries does not tolerate corruption," I said firmly. "Our legal team is already working with the appropriate authorities, and we will ensure that Mr. Foster is held accountable." As for investor confidence, I let a small smile cross my lips. If anything, today proves exactly why I was the right person to take this company forward. Before I could take another question, The doors at the back of the room opened, and an unexpected guest entered. Margaret Foster. The crowd immediately turned, cameras flashing as the ex-wife of Bradley Foster walked confidently toward the front. She was elegant as always, her presence commanding attention even as whispers filled the air. I remained still as she stepped onto the stage, taking her place beside me. Margaret met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw something new in her eyes: approval. Then, she turned to the audience. "As some of you know," she began, her voice strong, "I have spent years working in urban development and philanthropy, investing in projects that promote sustainable city growth. I have watched this company from the sidelines, and I have seen both its triumphs and its failures." She took a breath. "My ex-husband's actions were disgraceful. His attempt to destroy what Evelyn Lancaster has built was not only unethical, it was pathetic." Another wave of murmurs spread through the audience. "I am here today to announce that my foundation will be donating an additional $50 million to the Lexington Street Project," Margaret declared. "Because I believe in this project. And more importantly, I believe in the woman leading it." Applause erupted. The cameras flashed, capturing every moment as Margaret and I exchanged a handshake. Bradley had tried to use lies to destroy me, but his own ex-wife had just publicly aligned herself with me instead. This was the final nail in his coffin. By the time the press conference ended, the media frenzy was in full swing. Margaret and I walked side by side down the hallway, away from the flashing cameras. "You handled that well," she said finally. I glanced at her. "Did you mean what you said up there?" She smirked. "Every word." I exhaled slowly. "I wasn't expecting you to get involved." Margaret shrugged. "Bradley underestimated you." "So did I. But you proved us wrong." She paused, then added, "And I don't take kindly to people who sabotage strong women." I nodded, understanding. At the end of the hall, my assistant was waiting with an update. "Miss Lancaster," she said, holding out a phone. "You might want to see this." I took the phone and glanced at the screen. The headline was already trending worldwide. "Bradley Foster under investigation for corporate fraud. FBI involvement confirmed." A slow smile spread across my face. Bradley had tried to destroy me. But in the end, he had only destroyed himself. The morning after the press conference, I stood by my office window, sipping my coffee as I watched the city stir to life. The sun had barely risen, yet the streets below buzzed with movement, cars weaving through traffic, pedestrians rushing to their destinations. Lancaster Tower loomed over it all, its steel and glass reflecting the dawn's first light. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm. Bradley Foster had made his last move. And he had lost. I turned my attention back to the reports on my desk. The financials from the Lexington Street Project were already showing signs of recovery. Investors, once hesitant, were returning with renewed confidence. Margaret Foster's public endorsement had sent a shockwave through the corporate world, one that left Bradley utterly isolated. And then there was the headline that had been dominating every news outlet for the past 12 hours. "Bradley Foster indicted on federal charges. FBI raids former CEO's penthouse." It had taken years for him to build his reputation. It took me less than a month to dismantle it. I leaned back in my chair, flipping open a fresh folder. My legal team had been digging through Bradley's financial history, and what they found was almost too easy: offshore accounts, shell companies, backdoor deals that violated SEC regulations. The moment we handed the files over to the authorities, it was only a matter of time before they came for him. My phone buzzed. A text from Alan, my attorney. "FBI arrested him an hour ago. Thought you'd like to know." I smiled, setting my coffee down before replying. "Send me the footage." Within minutes, a secure link popped up in my inbox. I clicked it, and my screen filled with the grainy footage from a news helicopter hovering over Bradley's penthouse. The front doors burst open, and 2 federal agents stepped inside. Moments later, Bradley emerged in handcuffs, his face contorted with rage. He struggled against them, shouting something the microphones couldn't catch. But the cameras caught everything else: the way he thrashed, the way his face twisted in fury and disbelief. I let the video play twice before finally shutting my laptop. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, raised it slightly in the direction of my window, and whispered, "To your downfall, Bradley." Then I took a slow, satisfied sip. Later that afternoon, I arrived at the Lancaster boardroom, where the remaining executives waited. Unlike the last time I sat at this table, the energy had shifted. There was no arrogance, no condescension, only a quiet, wary respect. I placed my hands on the table and let my gaze sweep over them. "Bradley Foster is gone," I stated, my voice calm but firm. "And now we rebuild." Diane Miller, ever the pragmatist, nodded. "The Lexington project is already regaining momentum. Investors are back on board. We need to move fast to capitalize on this." I nodded. "Agreed. I want a new marketing strategy rolled out immediately. Press releases, public outreach, we need to control the narrative before anyone else does." Another board member spoke up hesitantly. "And what about the vacant CEO position?" A brief silence followed. I leaned back in my chair, tilting my head slightly. "I assume there's no objection to my reinstatement?" A few exchanged glances, but no one spoke against me. They knew there was no fight left to be had. Diane gave a small nod. "Motion to reinstate Evelyn Lancaster as CEO of Lancaster Industries." "Seconded," came another voice. I folded my hands. "All in favor?" Every hand went up. It was done. I had taken back my company. I had won. That evening, I returned to my penthouse, exhaustion finally setting in. The weight of everything, the battles, the victories, the strategy that had consumed my every waking moment, settled into my bones. I stepped out onto my balcony, overlooking the glittering city below. For weeks, I had been fighting, planning, waiting. Now, there was nothing left to fight for. I had reclaimed everything Bradley had tried to take from me. And yet, as I stood there, staring at the city my mother had loved so much, I felt the faintest trace of something unexpected. Not regret, not sadness, but the realization that this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. 1 year later, I stood before the towering glass structure of the Lexington Street development, the sunlight gleaming against the polished steel framework. The project was more than just a corporate investment. It was a statement. A declaration of power, resilience, and the enduring legacy of my mother. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored black blazer as I took in the scene before me. Reporters, city officials, high-profile investors, and hundreds of Lancaster Industries employees filled the plaza. Banners bearing my mother's name hung from the upper floors, fluttering gently in the wind. Cameras clicked in rapid succession as the anticipation in the air grew thicker. A year ago, I had walked out of this company, humiliated, stripped of my title, and underestimated. Today, I was standing at its pinnacle, more powerful than ever. A hush fell over the crowd as I stepped forward, taking my place behind the podium. The microphone crackled softly before I spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today," I began, my voice steady and clear. "This project is more than just another development. It is a vision, a dream that my mother, the great Eleanor Lancaster, dedicated years of her life to bringing to reality. When she spoke of Lexington Street, she didn't talk about profits or investors. She spoke about the people who would live here, work here, and thrive here." I paused, glancing at the reporters waiting eagerly for their quotes. A year ago, this project was nearly destroyed by greed and incompetence. There were those who believed it was too ambitious, too costly. There were those who thought Lancaster Industries had lost its way. I allowed the weight of my words to settle over the crowd. But today, as we stand before the completion of this extraordinary development, I ask you, were they right? A resounding no echoed through the plaza, followed by a ripple of applause. I smiled slightly before continuing. "This project has created thousands of jobs. It has brought sustainable energy solutions to the city. It has proven that smart business isn't just about the next quarter's earnings, it's about the legacy we leave behind. And today, we honor that legacy." I reached for the ceremonial ribbon-cutting scissors, gold and gleaming in the afternoon sun. My fingers curled around the handles, and with one decisive motion, I cut through the crimson fabric. The crowd erupted into cheers as the doors to the Lexington Street development officially opened. It was done. Not just the project. Not just the battle against Bradley Foster and the corrupt board members who had tried to erase my mother's work. I had cemented my place as the true leader of Lancaster Industries. The same people who had mocked me now stood in the crowd, applauding. The executives who had once doubted me were now shaking my hand. Investors who had abandoned ship during the company's darkest days were now lining up, eager to be part of whatever I built next. And at the center of it all, I stood, untouchable. The reception that evening was held in the grand atrium of the Lexington Tower. Champagne glasses clinked as waiters moved through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres. The city's elite had gathered, eager to align themselves with the woman who had defied expectations. I moved through the room with effortless poise, exchanging pleasantries with influential figures, accepting congratulations, and, more importantly, solidifying future alliances. Quite the comeback story, a familiar voice mused behind me. I turned to find Margaret Foster standing near the bar, swirling the golden liquid in her glass. I smirked. You could call it that. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Or you could call it what it really was, war. I tilted my head, acknowledging the truth in her words. Wars have casualties. Margaret chuckled. Yes, and from the looks of things, Bradley was the greatest one. Her words lingered in the air between us. It had been months since his arrest. The trial had been swift and merciless: fraud, embezzlement, corporate sabotage. He had tried to fight, of course, but with the overwhelming evidence stacked against him, there was no escape. The last I had heard, he had taken a plea deal. 10 years in federal prison. I had considered visiting him once, just to see the look in his eyes when he realized that everything he had tried to steal from me had only made me stronger. But in the end, I hadn't needed to. His downfall was satisfaction enough. Margaret took a slow sip of her drink before setting the glass down. So, tell me, Evelyn, what's next? I glanced around the room, taking in the faces of my allies, my rivals, the ones who had doubted me, and the ones who now feared me. Lancaster Industries had been restored, but this was only the beginning. I had spent years fighting for this company, proving myself, dismantling those who stood in my way. Now, I was ready to build something even greater. I met Margaret's gaze, a slow, confident smile curling at my lips. Now, I said. Now, I take everything. Later that night, I stood on the rooftop of the Lexington Tower, the city stretching endlessly below me. The skyline was a sea of lights, each one a testament to power, to ambition, to the relentless pursuit of success. I let out a slow breath, closing my eyes for just a moment. Everything my mother had worked for had been preserved. Everything I had fought for had been won. And yet I knew this was just the start. Power was never static. It was fluid, shifting, evolving. Those who believed they had secured it were often the ones who lost it the fastest. I had no intention of making that mistake. A gust of wind swept across the rooftop, rustling my hair as I turned to head back inside. Tomorrow, there would be new deals to make. New alliances to form. New empires to build. But tonight I had the last laugh.